The settlers of the Great Plains used to whisper that the Earth could keep a secret. In the winter of 1867, they learned just how true that was. Because on one lonely stretch of Nebraska prairie, a widow named Mariah Coldwell was building something that made no sense to anyone except her. And what happened inside that strange mound of soil would make seasoned builders question everything they believed about staying alive on the frontier. The strange part was how ordinary it looked from the outside. It was nothing more than a hump in the ground with a wooden door set low into the slope. Folks rode past it without slowing down. A traveler might mistake it for a root cellar. A hunter might think it was a place for storing potatoes or tools. Nobody imagined it was a home. Nobody imagined children would soon be laughing inside it, while the rest of the territory fought to keep frost from climbing their walls. Before we go deeper, take a second to tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and it helps this old channel find more people who love these frontier stories. The truth was, Mariah hadn't set out to shock her neighbors. She was simply trying to live through winter. That spring, a wagon accident in the runoff took her husband's life and left her with 3 young children and a claim she couldn't abandon. The small dugout they'd used the year before was crumbling. The cabin her husband meant to finish needed to strong men and months of work. She had neither. Yet what she did have was a growing cold that crept into her bones at night and a fear that came from knowing November was almost at her door. Her neighbors meant well. Eli Pritchard and his wife had offered to keep the children through winter. Their sod house was snug, warm, and built the way houses were supposed to be built. Eli had spoken kindly when he offered help, but his words carried a truth everyone understood. A woman alone couldn't build fast enough or strong enough to survive. And Nebraska winter, Mariah thanked him, but she couldn't leave her land. She couldn't walk away from the only thing her husband had left behind. And there was something else, too. Something she hadn't told anyone the winter before. On nights bitter enough to freeze water inside a cabin, and she'd noticed that the back wall of their dugout, the side pressed into the hill, had stayed warm. Not heated like a stove, but warmer than the air, familiar, constant. Like the earth itself was breathing steady while everything else froze. Back in Kentucky, she'd grown up with root cellars that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. People didn't think of them as miracles, just simple farm knowledge. But as she remembered those cellars, a new thought flickered through her mind. What if the house didn't stand against the cold? What if it stood inside something that could not freeze? The idea formed slowly. Deepen the dugout, thicken the roof, dig below the frost. Use the hillside the way her ancestors used the hollows back home. Let the earth carry the weight of winter instead of her shoulders. It sounded wild. It sounded foolish, but the children were coughing, the nights were turning hard, and firewood was already running low. So one October morning, with frost glinting on the buffalo grass, Mariah took up a spade and began to dig. Her daughter Ruth watched from the doorway, her small face sharp with doubt. "Mama, what are you doing? Making us a home?" Mariah said. "It looks like a hole for now," she answered, "but come January, this hole will be the warmest place in Nebraska." The wind that afternoon seemed to disagree. It cut through her dress and stung her hands as she worked. Still, she dug 12 feet into the hill, for tea down into the ground. She carved out a chamber big enough for her family and shaped it with the care of someone who knew she couldn't make a mistake. Each day brought new pain, blisters, cracked skin, sore shoulders, and the cold air hurt lungs. The children helped where they could. Carrying small buckets of clay, she worked by feel, by instinct, by memories of old stone cellars carved beneath Kentucky farms. What she built over those 6 weeks didn't look like a house at all. It looked like the kind of place animals might hide in during a storm. It looked temporary, improvised, wrong. Her neighbors tried not to stare when they passed, but the prairie carries every rumor miles, and the story of the widow digging her burrow spread fast. Folks whispered that she'd lost her sense, that no one could raise 3 children underground and expect them to see spring. But Mariah studied herself with one simple truth: the earth did not lie, and beneath the frost line, it held a warmth untouched by winter's teeth. As November stretched toward December and the shelter neared completion, Mariah shaped the walls against undisturbed soil, built a thick earthen roof, and carved a long entrance tunnel meant for trapping cold air before it ever reached her children. She used what she had: clay, grass, willow, timber salvaged from the half-built cabin. The day she moved her children inside, the first snow fell. It was silent, cold, and did not care whether she succeeded or failed. But deep inside that hell, surrounded by earth older than memory, Mariah felt something she had not felt since. Her husband died. The storm that tested every homestead on the prairie arrived without mercy. Old men who had lived through 3 decades of winters said later, they had never seen anything like it. The wind rose first, thin and sharp. Then the sky darkened as if someone had pulled a blanket over the sun. By afternoon, the world had turned white. On December 18, 1867, the temperature fell faster than anyone thought possible, 34 hours by midnight. The wind screamed across the plains with enough force to tear shingles off roofs and drive snow into every crack a builder failed to seal. Families burned through their firewood as if feeding a living beast that grew hungrier with every gust. Inside the Pritchard house, Elizabeth kept to children wrapped in coats, even in bed. Their breath thawed the air, ice formed on the inside of the windows. Eli fed their stove every 2 hours, his hands blistered from splitting logs in the raging wind. Still, the inside temperature sat around 40, maybe 45, at the Hutchinson place. Things were worse. Their hastily built shanty shook like a riverboat in a storm. The gaps in the walls howled as snow pushed through the chinking. They burned chairs, then a table. On the third day, part of a bed frame, anything to keep the fire alive. Across the settlements, families suffered in silence, believing that the Coldwell widow and her children could not possibly have survived. Inside that mound of dirt with no fire, no chimney, no windows, people spoke soft, fearful words around their own stoves, imagining what Mariah must be enduring. A woman alone, 3 children in a hole in the ground, but deep beneath 3 feet of snow. Something remarkable was happening inside Mariah's earth shelter. The storm was only a distant roar. The thick walls absorbed the cold slowly, refusing to surrender the warmth stored in their heavy soil. The entrance tunnel did its job beautifully. The cold air pulled in the lower part of the slope and never reached the living chamber. The small ventilation shaft let stale air escape without letting winter in, and the temperature inside the shelter dropped only a few degrees. 68 down to 66, then it held steady. The children played checkers on a board scratched into a smooth stone. Ruth read from the family Bible, her voice soft and steady. William curled up barefoot beside his sister. They ate warm mush cooked on a tiny iron stove that wasn't running for heat, only for meals. The wind raged, snow piled high. Outside, temperatures reached 20 to below zero, but inside that hill, the air felt like early autumn. Midway through the storm, Mariah noticed Ruth studying the walls again, the same way she had during construction, quiet, thoughtful, unsure. "Mama," Ruth whispered one night as the wind pushed against the door of the tunnel. "Are we really going to be all right?" Mariah pulled her daughter close. "We are more than all right," she said. "We are warm. It doesn't feel like a real house." "I know, it feels like we're hiding." Mariah looked at the earthen walls, at the logs, at the soft glow of the lantern. She understood her daughter's fear. The world outside believed this shelter was a mistake. Maybe Ruth felt that weight, too. Billy Hutchinson said, "We live like animals," Ruth murmured. Mariah felt the flash of anger rise, then fall. She steadied her voice. "Dutch, Billy Hutchinson is burning furniture to stay warm. We are warm without touching a single stick of firewood. The earth is doing what a dozen men with axes could never do." "But how?" Ruth asked. So Mariah explained, it gently in words a child could understand. She spoke of the steady warmth below the frost line, of how soil absorbed heat the way a sponge absorbs water, of how their breathing, cooking, and living fed gentle warmth into the walls, and how those walls now gave that warmth back to them night after night. "The earth remembers warmth," Mariah said. "That's what keeps us safe." Ruth nodded slowly, a spark of understanding lighting in her eyes. That spark would matter later. When the blizzard finally broke on the fourth morning, the world outside had been carved into a white wasteland. Drifts reached the height of fences that trees bent under frozen weight. The settlement was silent except for the groan of ice. Mariah opened the tunnel door and stepped into the world again. The cold bit her skin instantly. Her hair frosted at the edges. In the distance, a thin trail of smoke rose from the Pritchard house, weak and tired. She didn't know it yet, but Eli had already saddled his horse. He believed he was riding toward a tragedy. He believed he would be digging through frozen soil to recover what the blizzard had taken. He rode slowly, breaking a path through deep drifts. His face burned from the cold, his hands had on the reins, and with every mile, he braced himself for the quiet he expected to find at the Coldwell claim. But what he found instead stopped him in the snow. He saw Mariah hanging laundry on a clothesline in the open winter air, and her dress flapped in the cold wind. But she wasn't shaking, her cheeks were pink, her hands steady. She looked like a woman who had just stepped out for a moment, not someone who had endured 3 days of the worst storm the territory had seen. Eli froze in his saddle. Mariah, he breathed. She turned, shading her eyes from the sharp morning sun. Didn't expect company, she said. He could barely speak. Are your children alive? She smiled faintly. They're warm inside, playing. Come on, I've got coffee. What happened when he stepped into that tunnel and the number he read on his thermometer would shake the entire settlement? When Eli stepped into the entrance tunnel, the cold wrapped around his legs first. It pulled like heavy water, settling low, just as Mariah designed it. Then one step up into the living chamber and the air changed. Warmth touched his face, soft, steady, impossible. He removed his hat slowly, almost afraid he was dreaming. Ruth and the boys looked up from their game, surprised to see him, but completely at ease. They wore simple shirts, no coats, no shawls. The youngest, William, wasn't even wearing shoes. Eli blinked hard. He tried to make sense of it. There was no fire, no smoke, no heat rising from a chimney outside. The small iron stove sat cold in the corner, yet the room felt like a spring morning. How? He whispered. Mariah poured him a cup of coffee. Her hands were steady, her expression calm. She had been waiting for this moment long before the storm arrived. You told me this wouldn't work, she said gently, but it did. He held the coffee cup, more out of habit than need. His fingers didn't crave warmth, but they already had it. Mariah, what's the temperature in here? She shrugged. Warm enough. But Eli hadn't come unprepared. He pulled a small brass thermometer from his coat pocket and held it away from his body. He waited and the mercury climbed. 68, 70, 72. Then it settled. 73 F. He stared at the glass like it had betrayed everything he believed. That's Mariah. That's warmer than my house with the stove burning day and night. She nodded. The earth did it. He walked to the back wall and pressed his palm against the soil. It felt cool, not cold, solid, alive in a way he had never understood before. His mind raced through every building he had ever worked on, every sod house he had helped repair, every cabin he had framed. None of them held warmth like this. You built a home inside a battery, he said quietly. Ruth grinned from her seat. I said the same thing. Eli looked around the chamber again. The thick roof, the deep foundation, the long entrance tunnel, the undisturbed hillside pressing against the back wall, all of it working together, not fighting the earth, but partnering with it. How long can it stay warm? He asked. Mariah sat on a wooden bench. As long as we live in it, our heat goes into the walls hold it, they give it back. The simplicity of it struck him with the force of revelation. Simple didn't mean small. Simple meant right. He rode home that afternoon a different man, carrying a truth heavier than the snow on his coat, and within days, the settlement knew. But not because Mariah talked, she wasn't the type to brag, but because Eli Pritchard told everyone he saw. Elizabeth visited first. She stepped inside the shelter, felt the warmth, touched the cold stove, and cried, not out of fear, but from the relief of knowing the children she loved were safe. Then came Howard Mullen, the carpenter who had mocked Mariah at the station. He brought his own thermometer. He stood in the chamber for 20 minutes without speaking. When he finally did, his voice cracked. "No fire at all, just for cooking," Mariah said, and during the storm dropped a little, maybe down to 66. The number hit him harder than the wind outside. Melon's own cabin had dipped to 38. Even with a roaring stove, his wife had frostbite. His walls had grown ice. G had spent decades building homes for the frontier. But this dug-in quiet structure outperformed every cabin, every sod house, every timber frame in 50 meters. Neighbors compared their fuel use. Pritchard's 1.5 cords burned in 3 weeks. Hutchinson's 2 cords plus furniture. Amlin, nearly 2 cords and still freezing. Coldwell Shelter 1/110th of a cord for cooking only, and the temperature always between 66 and 73. The numbers spread like wildfire, except this time the wildfire was truth. By January, something remarkable happened. The doubters grew silent, the whisper stopped, the pity turned into respect. Hard, quiet respect. The kind that settles deep and stays there. And that winter, for more families began digging into hillsides and banking soil against timber frames. And they copied Mariah's entrance tunnel, her thick roof, her deep floor, her thermal walls. Nobody called them Coldwell shelters, though. Some neighbors thought they should. Frontier people weren't much for giving credit. But privately in their kitchens and bedrooms and barns, they said the same words. She figured it out first. Mariah never claimed to be an inventor. She simply trusted the earth more than she trusted fear. She built from memory, instinct, and faith in the laws of nature her neighbors had forgotten. 3 decades later, her shelter still stood, expanded, reinforced, lived in, warm. A young homesteader once asked Mariah how she knew it would work. She smiled the way only a woman who has survived her life can smile. "I didn't know," she said. "I just paid attention." The Great Plains had offered her a truth older than cabins and stoves, older than sawmills and measurements. The earth stores warmth. The earth protects life, and if you work with it instead of against it, it gives back more than you can imagine. Powerful reflection. Mariah Coldwell didn't conquer winter by being stronger than it. She survived because she understood something most people overlook. Sometimes the greatest shelter isn't built above the ground. It's built inside the wisdom of the ground itself. If this story taught you something about resilience and the old survival ways that truly worked, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Soft call to action. If you want more real frontier wisdom and emotional stories like this one, make sure to subscribe. It helps more people discover these forgotten lessons of strength and survival.